Our political and constitutional history is quite different from that of most other newly independent countries, countries which were colonies and became independent after the war in Asia and Africa, and particularly in Southeast Asia. Because most newly independent countries start life anew with a brand new, fresh minted constitution. But when we became independent, we didn't do that. We decided to retain and to tweak our existing constitutional arrangements that had worked for Singapore when we were part of Malaysia, and that we had been working before that, when we were a self-governing state, before we joined Malaysia. He felt that it was better for us to evolve our model gradually, learning from experience, rather than to strive for some unworkable perfection. And Mr. Lee said that his best teacher of the difference between political reality and constitutional theory was the Tunku. He wrote, I think this is in his memoirs, he was in the Tunku's office and admiring a beautiful leather-bound, green-covered volume. It was a Pakistani constitution and presented to the Tunku by Ayub Khan, who was at one time president of Pakistan. So Mr. Lee admired the book. The Tunku told him, "You know, Kuan Yew, they make very good constitutions. They have many brilliant lawyers, and with every leader, they have to make a new one." So when we became independent, we cobbled together the Constitution of the Republic of Singapore, which is what we have today. Where did it come from? Part of the provisions from the state constitution, part of the provisions from Malaysia's federal constitution, which we adopted and incorporated, plus amendments which we made after separation. For example, amendments to safeguard our sovereignty and to ensure that any decision to give up our sovereignty would have to be put to a referendum of all of the voters in Singapore and not decided by the legislature. It's a roja. It's a messy document, and such a messy document that in 1970, Ms. Lee asked the British High Commissioner to get British constitutional law experts to polish it up. And it came back polished and shiny. And Mr. Lee thought that the British experts had done a first-rate job. The idea was, you look at the American Constitution, it's lasted 200-something years. And over these 200-something years, it's only had 20-plus amendments. And so you worship it. You get it precisely right, beautiful form of words. Every school child knows it, and that's what is going to guide the country for the next several hundred years. But in the end, Mr. Lee decided not to take that approach. He did not take in the brand new versions drafted by the British FCO office experts in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, because he concluded that the experts had not understood the context, nor why we had made certain basic decisions. He explained this to the House in 1984, when he moved the constitutional amendments to create the CMP scheme. And he used Thomas Jefferson's analogy of a suit. He said, "From my experience, constitutions have to be custom-made, tailored to suit the peculiarities of the person wearing the suit. Perhaps," and he changes his metaphor here, but I think you will forgive him this mixed metaphor. "Like shoes, the older they are, the better they fit. Stretch them, soften them, resole them, repair them. They are always better than a brand new pair of shoes." Our people have got used to and understand the present system, he said. It takes a long time. Any fundamental change takes a long time. But most important of all, the Constitution works. Many countries have tried and gone through several constitutions since independence. They have not brought stability or legitimacy. I believe It is better to stretch and ease an old shoe when we know that the different shape and fit of a younger generation requires a change. Like many of Mr. Lee's speeches, this speech, made in 1984 in this House, or in the old Parliament House, is still worth reading more than 30 years later. Sunday Times published an excerpt. I encourage you to read it, and I urge members to read the full version in the Hansard. And apart from talking about Singapore politics, he gave a tour of the horizon of how historically other countries, Britain, France, America, have each got their own histories and how the system evolved for them and how difficult it was. And he talked about France and how, as a young man in 1956, after attending a constitutional conference in London, he took a side trip to Paris on the way home. And the taxi driver took him around, showed him the sights, brought him to the National Assembly. This was 1956, and there was a democracy, and the politicians couldn't agree. And the taxi driver pointed at the National Assembly and said to him, "Walla, walla, walla." And he said that was an education for a young politician into the reality of politics. Unfortunately, Hansard didn't quite catch the nuance of this expression, and Hansard, I just recently noticed, transcribed it as V-O-I-L-A 3 times, as a result of which it made no sense, and you therefore won't find this in the Sunday Times because Sunday Times couldn't make sense of it and edited it out. But it's the most vivid example of how things can go wrong in politics. Highly civilized nation, system didn't work. In the end, General de Gaulle had to come back out of retirement and change the rules, took very stern measures, created the Fifth Republic. But even de Gaulle must die, and till today, the French, they also, like other countries, have political problems. Today, in the newspapers, if you read the Straits Times, Paris is in upheaval because there are strikes. Who's on strike? Taxi drivers, air traffic controllers, and for good measure, civil servants are on strike. So I think we have to understand the difference between the theory and the practice and what looks good on paper and what we need really truly for in real life to do. This is not masak-masak. The approach which we have taken has been to evolve our political system as we go along. Mr. Lee did this, we've continued to do this. Learning from experience, stretching and easing the old shoe, and adapting it to our needs and dealing with problems as new problems emerge as we understand the difficulties and the weaknesses. For example, we inherited a first-past-the-post parliamentary system modeled on the British House of Commons in Westminster. We've kept the first-past-the-post system. That's why here we sit opposite one another, the government and, in principle, the opposition on the other side. We don't sit in a semicircle the way the Americans sit in a semicircle, or the European legislatures sit in a semicircle. It's a parliamentary system, first-past-the-post. You are in opposition to each other. We kept that system, but subsequently we introduced new institutions, non-constituency MPs, nominated MPs, group representation constituencies, and an institution of an elected president. Each institution with a purpose, each one in line with our principles.